It was a day that would forever be etched in history. September 16th, 1992, the UK was about to face a financial crisis so intense it would shake its economy to its core.
It was in excess of $1 billion of profits.
15%. What?
And leave its government scrambling for answers. This was Black Wednesday. The UK had been part of the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, or ERM, a system designed to stabilize European currencies by pegging them to one another. The idea seemed solid.
£1 worth of foreign currencies, buying the pounds others wanted to sell. Then the Bank of England raised interest rates 2% to try to persuade speculators to stop selling. When that failed, it raised them another 3%, but still the enemy kept coming. By the end of the day, the pound had fallen several pennies below its supposed ERM floor. The government had to act.
But reality was different. The UK, struggling with economic turmoil, found itself under increasing pressure, and the pound was on the brink of collapse. The stage was set for disaster, and a man named George Soros was at the heart of it. In the early 1990s, the UK economy was in rough shape. Unemployment was rising, inflation was high, and the country was dealing with a massive recession. To make matters worse, the government had promised to keep the pound within a certain value against the Deutschmark, part of its commitment to the ERM. But the market didn't believe the pound could hold, especially when Britain's economic struggles were so obvious, and they weren't alone.
The functioning of exchange rate mechanism. As chairman of the Council of European Finance Ministers, I have called a meeting of the Monetary Committee in Brussels urgently tonight to consider how stability can be restored to foreign exchange markets. In the meantime, the government has concluded that Britain's best interests are served by suspending our membership of the exchange rate mechanism. As a result, the second of the two interest rate increases that I sanction today will not take place tomorrow, and minimum lending rate will be at 12% until conditions become calm.
Big-time speculators, led by George Soros, saw an opportunity. Soros and his team realized that the UK was living a financial illusion. The government couldn't afford to keep the pound within the ERM's tight limits. They bet against the pound, pouring billions into shorting the currency. As the pressure mounted, the pound began to falter. The UK government, desperate to save face, kept intervening, raising interest rates and pumping money into the currency. But it was only a matter of time before reality caught up.
We had a fairly strong sense that we were on to the kill. It indicated to us that we are at the end game, that there was no, this was an act of desperation. So instead of restraining us, it was really an invitation to double up, to try to sell as much more as possible.
On the fateful day, the tension reached a boiling point. The Bank of England, in a desperate bid to save the pound, raised interest rates to 15%. The idea was to make the pound more attractive to investors, but it was a move that only made the crisis worse. By this time, Soros and his allies had already made their move, and no matter how hard the UK tried, the pound kept losing value. As millions of pounds were sold off on the market, the government's actions were futile. The pound kept slipping, and then the inevitable happened. The government had no choice but to withdraw from the ERM, admitting defeat. The currency had lost its fight, and the UK was forced to abandon the system that had tied its economic future to Europe. Black Wednesday had arrived.
The government now has two deeply unappetizing options. It can put its Europe policy first, formalize the devaluation of the pound at a new rate against the Deutschmark, and re-enter the ERM, thus putting the pound back in the possible firing line. Or it can decide that today has proved that Mrs. Thatcher was right after all, that you can't buck the market, and that the pound had better float outside the ERM for the time being. That might hasten recovery from recession, but it would also wreck the government's strategy for zero inflation later this decade. The decision will be fateful.
The economic fallout was immediate, but the political consequences were even more severe. Prime Minister John Major and Chancellor Norman Lamont who had been steadfast in their belief that the pound could hold, now stood humiliated. The government had failed to protect the British economy, and the Conservative Party's reputation was in tatters. People were angry, the press was unforgiving, and the Major's leadership was in question. Yet, in the midst of all the chaos, Major kept his composure. While the rest of the world looked in disbelief, he remained calm.
I spend half my time being told by some people that I've suddenly become too aggressive, and half my time being told by other people that I ought to be more aggressive. I rather suspect in the midst of that I've got it right.
It's a rare moment of control in an otherwise catastrophic day, but even his calm couldn't quell the political storm that followed. The UK's relationship with Europe, already fragile, would never be the same again.
Unlike the Bank of England at that time, the Bundesbank did not take orders from politicians. How he handled its president would be critical. The Chancellor decided to be forthright.
The only thing which Mr. Lamont has had in mind was to force the Germans to lower interest rates. And he asked me if I could not lower the Lombard rate of the Bundesbank the next Monday.
The way he was speaking and trying to convince the Germans was showing that he felt he was in real political difficulties unless he got something out of the discussion.
But the story didn't end with the collapse of the pound. Over time, the UK economy, now free from the constraints of the era, began to recover. Inflation fell, and the economy slowly started to regain stability. Despite the short-term pain, the country emerged stronger, without the ties to the European currency system that held it back. Yet, the political damage was done. The Conservative Party's credibility had been shattered, and the idea of a united Europe was increasingly questioned. The scars of Black Wednesday lingered in the public's mind for years, and the rise of Euroscepticism was born. Looking back, Black Wednesday wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a turning point for Britain. It reshaped the country's economic landscape and marked the beginning of a long, complicated journey with Europe. A reminder that in the world of finance, nothing is ever truly guaranteed, and even the strongest promises can crumble when reality hits.